The night Naomi Calder walked into the yard at Coal Ridge Ranch, snow had not yet fallen, but the whole valley could already smell winter coming in on the wind. She did not ask for pity, did not ask for a warm room by the fire, and did not ask for a single dollar in wages. When Warren Cole asked what she wanted to be paid for her labor, the widow only looked toward the dirty straw pile behind the cattle barn and said quietly that she did not need wages at all. The cowhands standing near the fence laughed out loud at the strangeness of it, certain they were listening to a woman, half out of her mind with grief. But before Christmas arrived, the very men who laughed the hardest that evening would be standing outside her door in the freezing dark, humbled and afraid, begging to know the secret that was keeping her cattle alive while theirs went down one by one in the snow. Stay until the very end, because the secret Naomi kept hidden that autumn was never about money at all. It was about the one thing the whole valley had already decided was worthless enough to throw away. Autumn was dying hard over Alder Creek Valley that year, and everyone who worked the land could feel it happening. Cold wind rolled down off the mountain ridges each evening. The grass along the fence lines had gone the color of old rope, and every rancher for 20 miles around had already begun counting hay bales the way a man counts the days he has left before something terrible arrives. The sky stayed a flat, colorless gray from morning until dusk, and the creek that gave the valley its name had already begun forming thin sheets of ice along its slower edges. Naomi Calder appeared on the dirt road leading into Coal Ridge Ranch, with no fine carriage rolling behind her, no family walking at her side, and no one in the world left to protect her from whatever waited ahead. She wore a coat that had clearly belonged to someone larger once, sleeves folded back twice at the wrist, and she carried only a small cloth sack slung over one shoulder, its weight suggesting she owned almost nothing at all. The hands working near the corral recognized her before she had even reached the gate, because everyone in Alder Creek knew the widow of Caleb Calder, the man who had frozen to death out on the open range during the great blizzard the winter before, leaving his young wife with nothing but his name and an empty cabin. She found Warren Cole standing near the corral fence and asked him plainly for work, her voice steady despite the cold biting at her hands. Warren told her just as plainly that winter was already coming fast, and that he had no money left over to pay another hired hand through the lean season ahead. Naomi answered simply that she did not need wages, and the words hung strangely in the cold morning air until 3 of the cowhands leaning against the fence rail began to laugh at what they took for foolishness or desperation dressed up as pride. Nolan Briggs happened to be standing there that same morning, discussing a cattle sale with Warren over a shared cup of coffee, and he looked Naomi over slowly from her worn boots to her frayed collar before remarking, in a voice loud enough for the whole yard to hear, that poor folks who run out of options like to give their desperation a prettier name, calling it self-respect instead. Naomi did not flinch and did not answer him directly. She simply turned back toward Warren and asked for 3 things only, nothing more, nothing less. A place to sleep in the small empty room beside the old storehouse, work tending the cattle in the barn, and permission to take whatever Warren was already planning to burn or throw away. Warren studied her face for a long moment, unable to understand why a woman with absolutely nothing would refuse the one thing that might actually keep her fed through winter, and that unanswered question would follow him quietly for weeks to come, gnawing at the edge of his thoughts whenever he saw her working. Warren Cole suspected from that very first night that Naomi was hiding something behind her calm and steady manner, though he could not have said exactly what it was even if pressed. Still, he agreed easily enough to her strange terms, mostly because everything she had asked for was worthless in his own eyes anyway, no better than trash cluttering up his barn. Dirty bedding straw soaked through with manure, torn feed sacks no longer fit for grain, broken salt swept off the storehouse floor, cold ash raked out from the hearth each morning, loose chaff and stray grass caught between the floorboards of the old kitchen. All of it was simply refused to Warren, the kind of mess a man paid someone else to haul away and forget. Naomi began working before sunrise every single morning, long before the rest of the ranch stirred, mucking out the stalls, tending to the weakest cattle in the herd, mending broken fence rail with quiet efficiency, and gathering every scrap of fallen straw and every stray handful of dried grass she came across. Travis Boone, one of the younger hands on the ranch, found himself watching her more closely than he intended to, because she did not move like a woman, simply trying to survive one more difficult day. She sorted everything she collected with a strange and careful precision that seemed almost ceremonial, keeping wet straw separate from dry straw, clean ash separate from dirty ash, fresh manure separate from older manure, as though she were quietly assembling the pieces of something far larger than any of them could yet imagine. The other cowhands soon began calling her the trash widow behind her back, muttering the name whenever she passed with her arms full of scraps, and word of the nickname eventually reached Nolan Briggs, who took no small pleasure in spreading his own exaggerated version of the story through town. He told anyone willing to listen that Warren Cole had taken in a woman, willing to work for absolutely nothing, simply because she had nowhere left on earth to go, painting Naomi as a pitiful, half-desperate creature rather than the deliberate, careful woman Travis had begun to notice. Naomi never responded to any of the gossip that drifted back to her, choosing instead to use the quiet hours after dark to drag sack after sack of soiled straw toward the old icehouse, standing forgotten behind the ranch buildings. The low stone structure had once been used to store blocks of river ice through the hottest months of summer, but it had sat empty and abandoned for years, its heavy door hanging slightly crooked on rusted hinges. Travis noticed another small habit of hers as well, one that struck him as genuinely strange the first time he saw it happen. Naomi would drive a length of iron rod straight down into the packed layers of manure and old straw piled inside the icehouse, then press her bare palm flat against the top of the rod, holding perfectly still as though listening for something rising up through the metal itself, though Travis had no earthly idea why the heat under a manure pile would matter to anyone at all. When Warren finally worked up the nerve to ask her outright what exactly she was doing in that old icehouse night after night, Naomi only looked at him for a moment before answering that she was keeping a little piece of autumn safe before winter came, and took every bit of it away. News of the widow working for nothing at all spread through every corner of Alder Creek within a matter of days, carried from porch to porch and shop counter to shop counter like the first cold wind of the season. Inside Claire Whitlock's general store, ranchers leaned against the counter for warmth and traded theories about the strange woman Warren Cole was keeping out at his place, some suggesting she was simple-minded, others whispering that grief had finally broken something loose inside her. Nolan Briggs made certain the story turned into an outright joke wherever he happened to tell it, and he told it often, embellishing a little more with each retelling. He announced in front of half the town one afternoon that if Naomi Calder ever came asking for work at his own ranch, he would pay her exactly what she deserved, which was nothing but garbage and cold air, and a few of the men gathered around him laughed along dutifully. Claire Whitlock did not laugh with them. She had been quietly watching Naomi come into the store week after week to buy needles and lengths of hemp twine, to purchase a few small sacks of shriveled barley seed that no one else in town would have bothered with, and to ask, almost shyly, whether Claire had any old flour sacks the mice had already chewed through and ruined for regular use. Naomi never explained herself to a single soul in town, no matter how curious the questions became, or how pointed the stares grew whenever she walked past. She traded her sewing skills to Paige Rourke in exchange for a stack of torn wool blankets that Paige had been meaning to throw out for months, mending Paige's husband's work shirts in return for scraps most other women in the valley would have burned in the stove without a second thought. Anyone paying close enough attention might have begun to see the outline of something forming, some structure meant to hold in heat and keep out the worst of the wind, though nobody in Alder Creek that autumn was paying nearly that much attention to a poor widow gathering rags and broken seed. Nolan Briggs, for his part, had quietly begun stockpiling hay and feed of his own throughout the season, convinced in his bones that this coming winter would be a hard one, harder than most people around him were prepared to admit. He was already planning, in the careful and patient way of a man who enjoyed watching others suffer just a little before he offered them relief, to wait until the mountain passes locked shut with snow before selling that same stockpiled feed back to increasingly desperate ranchers at 3 or 4 times what it was worth. Naomi understood exactly what Nolan was building toward, though she had no money of her own to compete with a man like him on his own terms. All she had was garbage, 2 capable hands willing to work through exhaustion, and the knowledge her late husband Caleb had left behind, scrawled into the pages of a worn leather notebook she had carried with her since the day he died. On a night when the wind rattled hard against the icehouse door and threatened to tear it loose from its hinges entirely, she opened that notebook to its very first page by lantern light and read again the line Caleb had written there years earlier. That winter never actually killed cattle on the day the first snow finally fell, but killed them slowly instead, on every single day before that, whenever people had waited far too long to get properly ready. Inside the old icehouse, working almost entirely in secrecy, Naomi turned the abandoned stone building into something closer to a living cellar than any ordinary storeroom. She laid flat stones carefully across the packed dirt floor, then built up layer upon careful layer of soiled straw and manure, dusting each new layer with clean ash to help hold down the worst of the smell, before finally covering the entire mound with rough wooden planking, scavenged from a collapsed section of fence. Slowly, almost invisibly at first, warmth began rising up out of the packed layers beneath those boards, a gentle heat that seemed almost impossible given the freezing air pressing in from every side outside the walls. She hung old feed sacks over every gap where wind might slip through the stonework, draped torn blankets across the heavy doorway to seal in the growing warmth, and set shallow wooden trays directly onto the warmest section of floor she had built. Into those trays she scattered handfuls of shriveled barley and broken grass seed, watering everything only very lightly so as not to rot the fragile beginnings taking root. It was not a vegetable garden in any conventional sense, and it was not a grain store either, but rather an entire quiet system for coaxing tender green sprouts up out of nothing at all in the very dead of winter. Feed meant to keep weakened cattle alive when every other source of nourishment had already failed them completely. Travis Boone stumbled upon the faint glow of lantern light spilling from beneath the icehouse door close to midnight, one particular evening. Curiosity finally getting the better of caution, and when he pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, he stopped completely still at the sudden warmth pressing against his cold-numbed face. Outside, the wind cut like a blade honed sharp against bare skin, yet inside that low stone room the air smelled unmistakably of damp earth and new growth, as strange and impossibly out of place as springtime itself would have been in the middle of December. Naomi asked him plainly, without apology, to keep whatever he had seen entirely to himself, admitting honestly that she did not yet know for certain whether her fragile system would hold once the real, heavy snows finally arrived in earnest. When Travis asked, not unkindly, why she had not simply offered the idea to the other ranchers, scattered across the valley in exchange for a fair price, Naomi told him quietly that men like Nolan Briggs would only twist the knowledge into a weapon, using it to squeeze money out of desperate, frightened neighbors rather than using it to save a single suffering animal from an unnecessary death. It was in that quiet exchange, standing together in the strange warmth of a room that should not have been warm at all, that Travis began to truly understand. Naomi was not selfish in the slightest, only deeply afraid of what might happen if her hard-won secret ever fell into precisely the wrong hands. Later that same night, after Travis had slipped quietly back out into the cold, the very first pale green sprout pushed its way up through the dark soil in the trembling lantern light, a small fragile patch of spring hidden away deep beneath the frozen floor of winter. By the early days of November, one of Warren's oldest cows had stopped eating altogether, her legs trembling weakly beneath her, and her eyes gone cloudy and dull, and Warren privately expected the animal to be dead well before the first real snowfall settled over the valley. Naomi asked to care for the failing cow herself, without offering any explanation for why she believed she could succeed where nothing else had worked. She used no strange tonic bought from a traveling salesman and no forbidden medicine whispered about in town, Only small, careful amounts of the fresh green sprouts from her hidden trays, warm water mixed with the last dregs of old molasses, scraped from the bottom of a jar, and a simple mineral cake she mixed herself from broken salt, clean ash, and finely ground grass. 3 days later, to the quiet astonishment of everyone who had already written the old cow off as good as dead, the animal rose unsteadily onto her own legs and slowly began chewing her cud once again, alive and improving by the hour. Warren said nothing about it out loud to anyone, but he began watching Naomi with an entirely different kind of attention from that morning forward, no longer dismissive but genuinely curious. He finally asked Travis, one evening, as they finished the last of the chores, together, whether he had any real idea what the widow was actually doing out there in that old icehouse, night after night. Travis considered the question carefully before answering that he could not say for certain, but that he knew one thing without any doubt at all, that she was not working for nothing the way everyone assumed. She was taking payment, he said slowly, in something the rest of them did not yet know how to give her in return. At almost the very same time, Nolan Briggs began to notice that the weakest cattle over at Coal Ridge were not declining the way weak cattle were declining at every other ranch across the valley that season, and the observation gnawed steadily at him day after day. He sent one of his own hired men out to watch Naomi from a careful distance without being seen himself, and the man reported back only that she carried heavy sacks into the old icehouse most nights, but could never manage to see clearly what happened. Once the heavy door swung shut behind her. The not knowing bothered Nolan far more than almost anything else could have, because there was nothing in the entire valley he despised more deeply than the thought of someone else holding information that he himself did not possess. He told Dean Mercer, in a tone that left little room for argument, to find out exactly what the widow was hiding out there in secret, insisting bluntly that if she truly had discovered some reliable way to keep cattle alive through a hard, brutal winter, that knowledge alone would be worth considerably more than gold before the season finally ended. The first real snowfall arrived earlier and heavier than anyone across the valley had predicted, closing the narrow mountain pass almost overnight and cutting off the supply wagons that normally hauled feed and grain down from Cheyenne on a regular schedule. Hay stores locked away in barns across Alder Creek suddenly became worth considerably more than hard currency in anyone's pocket. And Nolan Briggs moved through those first tense days like a man who had been patiently waiting all along for precisely this moment to finally arrive. He announced to the valley that he would begin selling from his own carefully stockpiled hay, but at a price so steep and unforgiving that many of the smaller ranchers simply could not afford to buy what they desperately needed. Tyler Ashby, one of the youngest ranch owners working the valley that year, was forced to sell off a portion of his own struggling herd just to scrape together enough money to buy feed for the rest, and a quiet current of resentment began building beneath the surface across Alder Creek, even as no single rancher dared to openly challenge Nolan, since he alone now controlled the only remaining supply anyone had access to. Naomi continued working at Coal Ridge without pay through all of it, unbothered by the growing storm outside, and the growing suspicion swirling around her inside town. The talk about her slowly shifted from open mockery into something closer to genuine unease and suspicion among the townsfolk. Some claimed she carried a charm or some old superstitious trick learned from her grandmother. Others whispered darkly about forbidden medicine smuggled in from somewhere far away, and a few even went so far as to accuse her outright of stealing feed secretly from Nolan's own guarded stores under cover of darkness. Eventually, Nolan rode out to Coal Ridge himself on a gray, bitterly cold morning, standing squarely in the middle of the snow-packed yard and demanding loudly that Warren hand the widow over so he could question her personally about what exactly she had been doing. He argued, his voice gus carrying easily across the yard, that if she was using something dangerous or unnatural on the cattle, the entire valley had an undeniable right to know about it before anyone else's herd suffered for it. Naomi walked out to face him without the slightest trace of fear crossing her expression, and told him calmly, evenly, that he only wanted answers now because his precious stockpiled hay was no longer the sole remaining thing standing between the valley's cattle and certain death. It was the very first time she had openly touched the raw, exposed nerve of Nolan's greed in front of gathered witnesses, and everyone standing frozen in that yard felt the tension shift palpably in the cold air between them. On a night when the wind blew harder and colder than it had all season long, someone forced open the heavy door of the old icehouse under cover of darkness. Several of the carefully tended seed trays had been knocked over and scattered. A sack of broken salt lay spilled and wasted across the stone floor, and the heavy blanket meant to trap the room's precious warmth had been torn nearly in half by rough, deliberate hands. Naomi discovered strange boot prints pressed clearly into the fresh snow just outside the door the following morning, evidence of exactly what she already suspected in her heart. She did not cry out or fall apart at the sight of the ruin before her. Instead, she knelt down in silence on the cold stone floor, gathering each fallen tray one at a time, laying fresh straw back carefully over what remained, working desperately to save whatever fragile sprouts still clung stubbornly to life beneath the wreckage. Travis wanted to ride out immediately and confront Nolan Briggs directly about what had clearly happened, his anger plain on his face, but Naomi stopped him with a firm hand on his arm. She reminded him quietly that an accusation made without solid proof would only succeed in making her look like a raving madwoman in the eyes of the entire watching valley. Still, the deliberate act of sabotage came at the very worst possible moment, striking just as the weather outside turned harder and more punishing than it had been at any point that season. The carefully maintained heat inside the buried composting layers dropped noticeably overnight, and roughly half of the remaining seed trays were lost entirely to the sudden cold. Naomi worked straight through until dawn to rebuild whatever she possibly could by the light of a single flickering lantern, her hands raw and aching from the effort. Warren Cole, watching from a short distance, no longer saw her as some strange and inexplicable hired hand he barely understood or trusted. He came out himself before first light, carrying fresh lumber, clean ash, and a stack of spare feed sacks, working steadily alongside her without offering a single word of complaint despite his own aching joints and weary bones. It marked the very first time any established rancher in the valley had knelt down beside her and worked the problem her way, rather than simply standing back to watch from a safe, skeptical distance. Before that long, difficult night was fully through, Travis found a torn scrap of black leather glove caught on a bent nail near the broken doorframe. The exact same kind of glove Nolan Briggs was known throughout the valley to always wear. Naomi, however, chose not to rush toward any public accusation just yet. She wanted Nolan to expose his own guilt eventually, in his own careless time, standing before the full weight of the entire watching valley, rather than being caught in some quiet, easily denied confrontation. By the middle of December, ranches scattered all across Alder Creek Valley began losing cattle in earnest, not in sudden dramatic numbers all at once, but steadily enough day after day to genuinely frighten every rancher watching their own herds shrink. Animals grew weak on hay already gone moldy in storage, could not properly digest what little decent feed remained available to them, suffered from a growing lack of essential minerals, went without enough warm water through the coldest hours, and simply wore themselves down against the relentless, grinding cold until they could not rise again. At Coal Ridge, by striking contrast, even the weakest members of Warren's herd somehow managed to remain standing through it all. They were not fat or miraculously thriving by any stretch of the imagination, but their eyes stayed noticeably clearer, their steps stayed steadier beneath them, and far fewer of them went down permanently into the snow compared to every other herd in the surrounding valley. Ranchers who had once laughed openly at Naomi's strange behavior now began slowing their wagons deliberately as they passed by Coal Ridge on the main road, staring longer and longer into the yard each time they went by, saying little but noticing everything. Tyler Ashby was the very first to finally knock on Naomi's door, all of his earlier pride completely gone out of him by that point. He told her plainly, and without any pretense left, that his own herd was dying off steadily, and that he desperately needed to know what exactly she had done differently to keep hers alive. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, remembering clearly the sound of his careless laughter outside Claire's store weeks earlier, but she did not turn him away out of spite or lingering resentment. Instead, she asked him gently whether he had kept any of the dirty bedding straw he normally would have simply burned without a second thought, and Tyler was genuinely startled to realize that the very thing he had planned to set fire to was the first thing she wanted to know about. She showed him one small, carefully chosen piece of what she knew, teaching him how to mix warm water with old molasses and broken salt to steady a dangerously weakening animal for a short while, though she still deliberately batted back the fuller secret of the buried heat and the hidden trays of growing green sprouts, uncertain, yet, whether the wider valley had truly earned all of it at once. Why? Travis wondered privately as he watched her work with Tyler that afternoon. Was she saving other people's cattle while still keeping the deepest part of her secret so carefully guarded from the very people she was helping? On the 23rd day of December, the real storm finally struck the valley in full, arriving with a violence that dwarfed everything that had come before it that season. Wind screamed down through the narrow mountain passes with a sound like something alive. The road leading to town vanished completely beneath drifting waves of snow. Fence lines disappeared entirely under the accumulating white, and barn roofs groaned ominously under the sheer weight piling up steadily above them. Nolan Briggs believed with complete confidence that this was finally the moment he had been patiently waiting for all along, certain beyond doubt that every rancher across Alder Creek would now be forced to buy from him at whatever exorbitant price he chose to name. But when the desperate ranchers finally opened the hay bales they had already purchased from him at such great cost, they discovered mold spreading thick and black through the very center of many bales, hay that had clearly been stored carelessly and left to rot slowly from the inside out while Nolan collected his payment up front. Several cattle that fed on the spoiled hay bloated dangerously and refused to chew their cud at all, growing sicker by the hour, and Nolan tried repeatedly to insist that the fault lay entirely with the buyers themselves for storing his product poorly after the sale. In the middle of all that mounting chaos, Dean Mercer finally broke down and confessed openly to both Claire and Warren that Nolan had forced him, under threat of losing his own position, to deliberately hide the genuinely good hay away in a separate location, selling off the poor spoiled hay first, while patiently waiting for prices to climb even higher once Christmas had safely passed. The stunning confession sent a wave of raw anger rippling through the gathered valley, but anger alone, however justified, could not save the cattle already collapsing helplessly inside their stalls that very night. Warren rode straight through the blinding storm to reach Naomi, not to demand anything selfishly for himself alone, but to tell her plainly and honestly that if she truly knew a reliable way to save them, the entire valley needed her help tonight, not tomorrow, not next week. Naomi looked back toward her small stone icehouse standing quietly behind the ranch buildings, toward the last surviving trays of fragile green sprouts still glowing faintly under lantern light within, and understood at last, with a kind of quiet resolve settling over her, that the secret she had guarded so carefully for so long could no longer remain hidden away in the dark. Naomi opened the heavy door of the old icehouse before Warren, Travis, Claire, Tyler, and a small gathering of grown ranchers who had all trudged in together out of the raging white storm behind her. They stepped inside one after another and stopped short almost immediately, stunned into silence by the sudden warmth pressing gratefully against their frozen, wind-burned faces, by the rich smell of damp earth and fermenting straw, by row after row of pale green sprouts glowing softly beneath the trembling lantern light in the very middle of a raging blizzard outside. For a long, suspended moment, not a single person standing in that crowded room could manage to speak at all. What they had spent months openly mocking as nothing more than worthless garbage turned out, in the plainest possible terms, to be an entire carefully engineered system for keeping living things alive through the very worst that winter could throw at them. Naomi explained each piece of the system plainly and without a trace of pride creeping into her steady voice, walking the gathered ranchers through every layer, one careful step at a time. Manure and straw together generated the steady rising heat beneath the floor. Clean ash kept the composting layers stable and properly controlled. Feed sacks hung along the walls trapped that hard-won heat safely. Inside the small stone room, shriveled barley grew steadily into fresh green feed under the lantern light, day after day, and broken salt mixed carefully with old molasses helped weakened, failing cattle recover their strength far faster than anyone had thought possible. She told them plainly that there was no real magic hidden anywhere in any of it, only that she had simply begun preparing seriously, long before any of the rest of them had even thought to start. Nolan Briggs arrived at the icehouse moments later, furious at being shut out entirely from the one secret that might have saved his own crumbling reputation, and he loudly accused Naomi of deliberately hiding her methods on purpose, while other people's helpless cattle died out in the freezing cold all around them. Naomi answered him without flinching or backing down an inch, telling him plainly that she had hidden it only from men exactly like him, men who wanted to turn simple survival into just another item to be bought and sold for profit. But tonight, she added firmly, anyone willing to actually work, willing to genuinely share, and willing to stop squeezing desperate money out of their own struggling neighbors was entirely welcome to learn every single part of it from her. Warren Cole stepped forward at once to stand firmly beside her. Travis produced the torn scrap of black leather glove found after the earlier break-in, and Dean Mercer confirmed openly, in front of everyone gathered, that Nolan had indeed once sent a hired man to secretly watch the old icehouse. Nolan's proud, arrogant composure finally cracked wide open in front of the entire watching gathering, and one by one, the very same people who had laughed cruelly at Naomi for months began quietly rolling up their sleeves, not to buy her hard-won secret from her, but simply to work honestly alongside her from that moment forward. Christmas Eve turned that year from a quiet night of solitary prayer into a night of shared, urgent labor across the entire valley. Naomi organized the assembled crowd with clear, confident purpose, sending some to gather soiled bedding straw from every barn nearby, others to collect clean ash from cold hearths, others to crush broken salt down into usable powder, others to move the weakest cattle carefully into shelter out of the biting wind, and still others to prepare warm water for whichever animals needed it most urgently. Lantern light swayed wildly against the driving, sideways snow as grown men pulled loaded sledges across frozen, uneven ground. Claire carefully wrote out the essential mixture recipes across a rough wooden board propped up near the barn door for everyone to see and follow. Travis dug out fresh layers for a hastily built second composting bed nearby, and Warren himself, using his own old weathered hands, hauled soiled straw back and forth without a single complaint ever escaping his lips despite the late hour and the biting cold. Naomi never became any kind of hero that night through grand speeches or bold, sweeping declarations shouted over the wind. She became the quiet center of everything happening around her simply because every single person working in that yard instinctively turned to her to know what needed to happen next. The very same men who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a charity case now worked steadily in respectful silence, following her calm instructions without argument or hesitation of any kind. Tyler Ashby brought his first genuinely weakened cow forward himself through the driving snow, and Naomi insisted he mix the emergency feed with his own 2 hands rather than simply doing it for him, wanting him to understand clearly, once and for all, that this was never some secret formula that could simply be purchased outright with money. It was honest labor, she told him firmly, hard-won discipline and careful preparation, nothing more mysterious than that, and nothing less demanding either. In the middle of all that determined activity, Nolan stood apart from everyone else near the edge of the busy yard, thoroughly and completely isolated. He still possessed his large stockpile of hay, his considerable money, and his fine, well-fed horses. But he no longer possessed the one thing that mattered most of all in a valley like theirs, the hard-earned trust of the people living all around him. Christmas morning finally arrived with the raging storm gradually softening into a strange, exhausted stillness across the valley. Not every single animal had survived that brutal, difficult night, but a far greater number remained standing than anyone had genuinely dared to hope for just hours earlier. The weakest cattle over at Coal Ridge, along with those from the handful of neighboring ranches that had followed Naomi's methods through the night, were back on their feet again, chewing slowly and steadily, breathing out clouds of white vapor into the sharp, clear morning air. Ranchers gathered together in a loose crowd outside Claire Whitlock's store as the full, damning truth about Nolan Briggs finally settled firmly over the entire valley. He had hoarded feed deliberately, driven prices far beyond what any honest family could reasonably bear, knowingly sold spoiled hay to desperate neighbors, and quietly sent a hired man to sabotage the very icehouse that had ultimately saved so many struggling lives that winter. No violence of any kind was ever needed to settle the matter properly. The valley delivered its collective judgment simply and quietly by turning away from Nolan entirely, all at once. No one bought from his stores again. After that morning, no one signed another cattle contract bearing his name. Dean Mercer walked away from his warehouse position for good, without a single backward glance, and Warren Cole publicly and deliberately tore up every remaining agreement that still existed between them. Nolan tried one final desperate time to buy Naomi's hard-won methods outright, offering her what amounted to a genuine fortune if she would agree to sell the complete formula to him and to him alone. He insisted she could become a genuinely wealthy woman before the new year even properly arrived if she would only accept his offer. Naomi refused him flatly, and without a moment's hesitation, repeating the very same words she had first spoken to Warren on the night she originally arrived at Coal Ridge months earlier, that she did not need wages of any kind. This time, though, standing tall in the pale morning light with the whole valley watching, the simple words no longer sounded anything like the quiet desperation of a poor, grieving widow with nothing left to lose in the world. They sounded, to everyone gathered there, listening, like a genuine declaration of who she truly was. She asked instead, calmly and clearly, that the valley come together to establish a shared communal store for the winter season, a place where every rancher could contribute their own useful scraps, their broken seed, their old straw, their clean ash, and their own honest labor freely. The hard-won secret, she said, would belong from now on to those willing to genuinely share it with their neighbors, never again to any single person willing only to hoard it away for private profit. By the story's quiet close, Warren Cole came to Naomi and offered her an entirely new kind of arrangement, one built on something far more lasting than simple wages ever could have been. Not payment in coin, but a full stretch of long-used land situated just behind the old icehouse, along with genuine authority to run and oversee the entire winter feed store for all of Coal Ridge going forward. Naomi was no longer simply a hired hand scraping by day to day on borrowed time and quiet desperation. She had become, in the eyes of the entire valley, something closer to the woman who personally kept winter itself at bay for everyone around her. Travis Boone watched her standing quietly before the open icehouse doorway that Christmas afternoon, warmth and fresh green growth glowing softly behind her in the lantern light, while spread out in front of her stood the very same ranchers who had once laughed cruelly at her expense, now standing with their heads bowed low in genuine, humbled gratitude. He understood at last, watching her there, that Naomi's true secret had never really been only the practical formula for buried heat and hidden green sprouts growing beneath old straw. Her real secret, the one that mattered most in the end, was that she had always been able to see genuine value in the very things everyone else around her had chosen to despise and discard without a second thought. In garbage, in a grieving widow, in patient silence, in careful preparation, and in simple, stubborn, unglamorous kindness, offered freely without expectation of return. The final quiet scene of that long, hard winter settled gently into Christmas afternoon across the valley. Snow lay heavy and undisturbed and white across every barn roof, for as far as the eye could see in any direction. Inside the old stone icehouse, a fresh new row of tender green sprouts had already begun pushing steadily up through the dark, warm soil once again. Naomi reached up and hung Caleb's old, worn coat carefully back onto its familiar wooden peg near the door, letting it rest there at last after so many months of carrying it with her everywhere she went, as though she no longer needed to live constantly inside the long shadow of everything she had lost the winter before. By Christmas, every single rancher across the whole of Alder Creek Valley wanted desperately to know Naomi Calder's carefully guarded secret. But only the ones genuinely willing to kneel down in the cold and mud and pick up what they themselves had, once carelessly thrown away, ever truly came to understand what her secret actually meant.